Bradley with Writerly Talk, which might become a show on my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the urban fantasy genre. While this is a standalone video, it is also a response to Brendan Dessner's video where he asked for someone to explain to him the popularity of urban fantasy. One of his books! This is one of his books! Since I'm amazing at explaining things, here you go, Brendan! To be honest, I'm using this as a way to get some experience with basic video editing and vlogging skills. I met Brendan once, like 3 years ago, so it's totally cool that I'm using his videos as an excuse to make mine, right? Brendan is also a great writer and you should go pick up his books. I'm going to include links to them below this video. Also, to my books, because I'm also a great writer. There are so many great writers that don't get mainstream attention. So many. It pays to explore a wee bit, and then it pays to explore a bit more. First, I'm going to talk about what urban fantasy is and what urban fantasy is not. I think this parses well with what Brendan describes in his video, is a fantasy novel taking place in modern times that has a hard-boiled detective story structure. Typical of the genre are Jim Butcher's Dresden Files novels and the earlier books of Laurell K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series, or Charlaine Harris's Southern Vampire Mysteries. They are not supernatural romances where the plot revolves around romantic intrigue, invariably between a normal person and a monster. Typical of this stuff are L.J. Smith's Vampire Diaries and, of course, the Twilight novels by Stephenie Meyer. Nor are they horror, supernatural or otherwise. Urban fantasy can contain horror elements, particularly monsters and magic, but urban fantasy isn't written to scare anyone. While urban fantasy contains lots of what I like in books, action, monsters, exotic situations, and people, magic, I'm not really a fan of the genre. For me, it's simple, and they're too shallow for me. And that's an important distinction, for me. I like a lot of things other people don't like, and I don't like many other things that people love. It's a flaw of mine. Overall, I can't buy into the idea that supernatural monsters and magic have existed for centuries, but the world in the books is very much like our world. Even if the monsters are secret or have only been recently revealed, I don't buy that their presence would allow history to happen as it has. Everything in our history, in real human history, is because humans did it. Not monsters. If there are nigh-immortal, incredibly powerful supernatural critters in the world, well, it would change the very concept of human agency in history. Were the conquest of Genghis Khan because of vampire intrigue? Was an evil wizard behind World War II? Why didn't first people magicians kick Europeans out of their lands when they landed? Or were the guys like Columbus and Cortez and bizarro wizards or vampires or whatever? And what about God? How does human religion deal with dudes who were at the crucifixion or can reliably say it didn't happen? All of human history is cast into doubt by the presence of supernatural critters as described in urban fantasy. And I've never read an urban fantasy book that dealt with the subject of human agency in such a world. I suspect that it doesn't happen because to do it would make the book, well, either science fiction or horror. It's simply easier to ignore the consequences of mind controlling and mortal monsters in the world and say, yeah, history nevertheless unfolded much like it does in our books, and let's avoid religion altogether. To me, it feels lazy and superficial. To me. Still, I get the appeal, and I know what escapism is, and few genres of literature are as escapist as urban fantasy. Seriously. Regular fantasy is like, dude, you get some depth. Comic book mocks urban fantasy for their lack of characterization and unbelievable plots. It's that bad. Still, how did it get here? I think I can answer the question. I think the secret sauce is the way that our culture has changed. So, Brendan, you're a fine writer and a lovely human being, but what you want out of urban fantasy is very 20th century. If you want a book rooted in our world and a development into the supernatural, well, you can get that, but it's horror. Urban fantasy audiences are very 21st century audiences. Which is to say, they've been prepped by video games and role-playing games and, yes, comic books to accept any weird-ass setting without giving a damn how it got that way. You don't need to rationalize to modern audiences that it's like our world but with magic. It takes no cinematic reveal or literary twist. Modern audiences are cool with a vampire walking into a bar to talk to a werewolf and her fairy girlfriend. They want it. If you can move past the 20th century bias of authors giving significance to supernaturalism, the appeal of urban fantasy books is clear. You've got these interesting, larger-than-life characters loaded with sex appeal doing crazy, action-packed things in exotic settings, but also rooted in everyday experience. The audience understands the moral, political, and physical background of urban fantasy, yet the story shares in the same scope and sense of the fantastic as medieval fantasy. At the same time, urban fantasy strips away the scares and gore one finds in horror novels. If you like the idea of vampires and ghosts in your books, but you don't like when they're written to scare the piss out of you, urban fantasy might be your gig. And that's it. I'm Kit Bradley with Writerly Talk. I hope you liked this video, subscribe with notifications, and check out the books written by Brendan Dessner and myself. Hope to see you soon.